Our next example is Old St. Peter's, and this is a wonderful example of what early Christian architecture was like. And please be sure that you understand that the question asks for you on the exam to talk about art and architecture. You need to talk about both of those. This is one of the most well-known of the early Christian churches, and in fact, it's funded by Constantine, as a number of other early Christian churches are. Constantine is, at the same time, funding a lot of pagan temples, so he's kind of famous for straddling the fence and working both sides. But nonetheless, it's significant that he is a patron for these kinds of structures, and they are very much needed. As we said before, those early Christians worship inside the churches, which is different from the Greeks and the Romans. And that as we have a growing number of converts, there's a growing need for these large, open, vast interior places that can hold all of these new Christian converts in their growing congregation. And these early Christian churches were modeled, as we explained before, on basilicas rather than on any sort of pagan temple from the past. Not many of these early Christian basilica still survive, and a few that do survive have really been modified. Very few of them are close to their original structure. Old St. Peter's here was extensively remodeled in the Renaissance and the Baroque era. But remember, they chose this basilica form because they liked that it was not associated with the pagan temples of the Roman religion. Instead, the basilica was a judicial kind of civic structure. So they preferred that rather than being tied in with any sort of old set of beliefs. A new religious system and a new type of religious architecture to go along with it. They also liked the basilica form because it was very large and open and had a very large interior. Old St. Peter's could hold about 4,000 worshipers at once. It was very long. It was around 403 feet long. That's all the way from one end to the other, and so it was really a large type of structure. Now let's talk a little bit about the terminology we use to discuss the structure and the different part of the structure. So here we have labeled in red the different architectural terms that you should know. We're looking here at images that are all reconstructions because, as we said, St. Peter's is remodeled heavily in the Renaissance and Baroque periods. So you need to know a couple of terms. You have the apse down here at the eastern end, the semicircular area. Okay, the apse is where the altar is located. That is the holiest location in the structure. Okay, before the apse is a crossing arm that crosses perpendicular to the structure. This is called a transept, and that is perpendicular to the main interior area of the structure called the nave. Along the nave are two side aisles on both sides, and you can see if you look at the cross section down here in the bottom right, the central large open area is the nave, and the two flanking are the side aisles. Outside, in front of the church, they had an atrium area. This often had a fountain inside. And the atrium was a place where worshipers could kind of come in, separate themselves from the world, clean themselves up, and really prepare to enter into the holy space of the interior of the church. Okay, so know all of those terms. Those are terms that you'd want to bring up when you're describing architecture of the early Christian period and these basilica that they constructed to accommodate their growing congregations. You want to include all of those, so make sure that you're making note of those and you understand. One other term that you'd want to include there, it's on your terms list, would be that this creates a structure that's called a cruciform plan. Sometimes you can even call it a longitudinal plan. If you look at the structure over here where the parts are labeled in red, you can see how it reminds you of a cross. That's where the name cruciform plan comes for. This becomes the standard footprint for Christian churches in the West, really pretty consistently from this point onward throughout all of the rest of the semester that we'll discuss. Okay. One thing that's important for us to understand too is that I'd like for you to know how they chose the locations for these types of structures. We discussed briefly in the introduction the cult of saints, and we talked about how important the lives of the saints were in early Christian belief, and the early Christians were drawn to visit the places where important events had occurred or where important saints were buried. And that's definitely true of Old St. Peter's. Old St. Peter's is buried on a cemetery, and it's the cemetery where they believe St. Peter was buried. There was a tomb saying that was identified with an inscription saying Peter is here, and that was the tomb that they accepted to be St. Peter's, and over that they placed the altar and the apse. So the altar and the apse of Old St. Peter's is buried over the cemetery that had the remains of St. Peter, and this is done going along with that belief in the cult of saints. If you can get close to the saints, to their remains, to anything they've touched in their lives, any of those kinds of objects, those will be considered relics. And getting close to those relics would be something that made you, as a Christian, a holier person. Okay, so relics can be the bones of a saint. Relics can be an object that they touched or used during their lives, like a piece of clothing or some sort of object. They have some relics that are pieces of the true cross, for instance, right? A part of the cross that Christ was crucified upon. So all of these objects have the potential to become relics. There are a lot of early records that talk about the role of relics in early Christianity. On this one in particular, what they would do is they would drop cloths down onto the tomb of Old St. Peter's. Those cloths would come into contact with the tomb, and then when they brought those cloths back up, they kind of retained some of that power of St. Peter. So a lot of people came to this location just to see the tomb, and people really tried to be buried here as close as they could to the shrine. And so Old St. Peter's was not just a church and a meeting place, but it was also kind of an indoor cemetery. And as we mentioned before, that earlier example of the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, that was found here in Old St. Peter's. Here are some images from that cemetery underneath Old St. Peter's. There were areas in the cemetery that were very wealthy on tombs, and those wealthy tombs were on top of earlier tombs from persecuted kind of lower class individuals. So it's kind of really fascinating to kind of see these images and know that this is what's underneath Old St. Peter's today. Here's kind of a reconstruction as to what that apse area looked like in the original Old St. Peter's, with the altar directly over the tomb that they identified to be Peter's. These spiral columns here were classical elements, and so here they're taking a classical element and they're giving it new Christian meaning. And when you're looking here, this is a drawing done before the reconstruction project began of Old St. Peter's. We mentioned the columns just briefly before there that surrounded the altar area as being classical in their precedence. And in fact, many of the elements of the architecture here were taken from other monuments around Rome and reused. We call that spolia. We talked about it really briefly when we looked at some other examples from the late imperial period. But most of the columns from Old St. Peter were taken from different monuments and reused. So kind of an interesting interpretation of taking old classical elements and now giving them new Christian meanings. Now remember, what they're trying to do here with these basilica is take that Roman form of a basilica and make it now significant in terms of Christian meaning. Romans, remember, did kind of plain exteriors. That's true of Old St. Peter's, not a lot of decoration on the exterior. And instead, Romans spent a lot of time making the interiors incredibly elaborate and luxurious. And that was also true for Old St. Peter's. So they're following a Roman precedent here, using a Roman form. But the reason that the Christians focus so much on the interior is for Christian kind of meaning and Christian symbolism. They want this interior space to be something that is otherworldly, to be something that is spiritual. And so they're using this Roman practice, and now they're giving it a lot of Christian meaning. We mentioned that they liked to use mosaics. We know that there were mosaics originally in Old St. Peter's. The Christians liked mosaics because they were made of glass. They reflected the light. They created a really glittering, mystical, otherworldly, transcendent kind of environment. But they also liked the mosaics because they reflected light. And again, light was meant to be symbolic of God's divinity. So there are a lot of reasons why mosaics appealed to those early Christians. And you definitely want to bring that up on an essay question talking about architecture, about how mosaic is the preferred form of architectural decoration on the interiors, and why they liked that, because of the mood it created and because of the way it reflected God's life, or light rather, and became kind of this symbol of God's divinity. Here's another kind of reconstruction you can see with a little bit of color, and you can see what we're talking about. There's a little bit of decoration on the exterior, some here on the facade, but overall, most of the structure is just a plain brick exterior. That's just how the Romans did it. So the early Christians are doing the same thing, but then you can look in the interior and see how it was elaborately decorated with mosaics, beautiful stones in the columns. So a lot of attention given to that interior. This one here is the Church of Santa Sabina. It is pretty close to being contemporary to Old St. Peter's. And so this is just an image to kind of give you an idea of what some of these early Christian churches looked like on the inside. Santa Sabina has not been heavily modified in comparison to the other structures. Okay, this is Santa Costanza. I think that we'll be really brief here, just in the interest of keeping things short. I do want to make sure that you are prepared for the exam, and I promise to give you all of the information you need for the exam. But I also know that watching this video instead of coming to class is probably not that wonderful, so I'm going to try and keep it brief for you. This is a mausoleum, and we have a lot of Roman things going on. Plain exterior, but an elaborately decorated interior. Some of the interior decoration is now lost, but if you look over on the sides at the ambulatory, this kind of circular walkway that surrounds that central space, and look up into the ceilings, you can see a lot of the original mosaics that still survive up there. Let me show you a detail. Here are the architectural sections and floor plan. The circular temples and circular buildings, remember the Tholos buildings, those were popular in the classical world. Now we're using those classical structures for Christian purposes. This one here is a mausoleum. A lot of the early Christian baptistries were also circular, so a Roman form given new Christian meaning. You can see that the mausoleum was originally built next to the Church of St. Agnes. And so again, the cult of saints was important here in the location of this funerary structure. Constantina wanted to be very close to St. Agnes and her relics and her power that still remained within those relics. You can see here those mosaics in the ambulatory. This one here is a portrait of Constantina. And this here is to the side of that portrait. And we might take just a minute to look at this in brief to just kind of explain to you how we're doing classical and non-classical things together, which is common in the early Christian era, and how we're taking Roman forms and giving them new Christian meaning. Again, something that's common in the early Christian era. The two main things that we keep talking about that describe early Christian art and architecture. When we're looking at this mosaic, you can see that we have a lot of Roman forms. First of all, mosaics were popular and the Romans used them. The early Christians also used them and gave them kind of new meaning by associating them with God's divinity and with mysticism. But here we have a white background with a vine motif, and that was really popular in Roman mosaics. It's an imperial motif, and we definitely have that connotation still going because Constantina is the descendant of Constantine, so part of the imperial family. But we have it now also connected rather to the story that's being shown below. And these are grapevines, and we have a harvesting scene of grapes down on the bottom. We've got the oxen and the driver and the load of grapes. And we have the figures over to the right on the bottom stomping the grapes and juicing the grapes. This was a really common subject in classical works. It was often associated with Dionysus, right, the Roman god of wine and revelry. What was very interesting is that Dionysus was at one point in time, according to legend, brought back from the dead after he'd been torn into pieces by the Titans. So Dionysus and his association with wine and his coming back to life after being dead were all kind of appropriated by the Christians and given now Christian meaning for Christ, right? There are a couple different things here that now have Christian meaning. A lot of times they talk about Christ as the vine. Christ is like this life-giving entity. So that's one meaning. Grapes obviously have reference to the wine that's used in the Eucharist, the Catholic sacrament. So the salvation of Christ is referred to by the grapes. And now we have this classical kind of setup and even some classical representation in the body, right, where they're giving them a little bit of anatomical detail, putting them in naturalistic poses, although it is abstracted overall. We not only have classical motifs given Christian meaning, but we do have classical elements in the style and non-classical elements in the style. So as we said, it's classical the way that they pay a little bit of attention to the anatomy, even though it's not entirely accurate. But if you look at the oxen, can you see the markings of the rib cage on that oxen? So they are more detailed than other examples that we've seen. We have a little bit of a foreshortened kind of portrayal of space. So this little portico over the wine stompers on the right comes out to us at an angle as though it's foreshortened into our space. That's classical. The putti, those are very classical. The subject matter, as we said, that's very classical. And these naturalistic kinds of poses. All of those things are classical elements, but it's combined now in with non-classical elements. As we already mentioned, it's very simplified. Now, part of that is because a mosaic as a medium just lends itself to simplification. But we have some other non-classical elements too. The bodies, even though we have that anatomical detail in those incisions of, or inclusions rather, of musculature and bulk, they really are disproportionate. They're a little too squatty, the heads are a little too big, the hands are a little too big. So that's a little bit less classical. The faces are a little more generic. There's not a lot of believable emotion. So those are things that are a little less classical too. So we've got this combination of the two put together in these mosaics. It's a good example of what early Christian art is doing in terms of subject matter and in terms of style. Here's another section of the mosaic. We're just going to kind of skip past this. It is another example of some of the same ideas we've been discussing. And we're going to go to our next example, which is the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. This is in Ravenna, in the northern part of Italy. A great example of, again, another funerary structure following after the Romans. It is very plain on the exterior, just a brick type of structure. But when we look on the interior, they're really going to go all out. The interior is full of luxurious materials and beautiful glittering mosaics. I love this image because you can see how the light captures that glittering aspect of the mosaics on the ceiling. This is a cruciform plan building. It looks kind of like a plus sign, and this is something that they had in the classical world, and of course now we're using that for Christian purposes, so the classical given Christian significance. But we have other elements in here that reflect the same sort of idea. This is an image of the dome. And the dome, remember, in the Pantheon was a symbol of heaven. That's a classical precedent and classical motif. The Christians use the dome in their architecture and they give it the same sort of meaning, right? The dome of heaven. So again, Roman forms given Christian meaning here. And this is one segment of the mosaic in particular where, again, we see Roman forms given Christian meaning. And we have a couple of things here that come from earlier Roman precedents. Most significantly is the way that Christ is dressed. Now, if you look at the date here, you'll notice this is after the time period in which Roman government embraces Christianity as its official religion. And remember, we said that marked a time when we start to see a transition in how Christ is portrayed. Earlier representations, Christ was often a shepherd or a philosopher, a really useful kind of guy. But after Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, we more often start to see Christ portrayed in the way an emperor would be portrayed. And that's what we're starting to see here. He's wearing a Roman emperor's garb, a golden robe, a purple shawl. That is Roman form. And now it's being given new meaning as Christ as kind of the emperor of the world. We also have the halo. Many of you probably don't know this, but the halo came from the classical tradition. Greek works often use a halo for Helios, the sun god. Hellenistic rulers in the Greek world began to use halos behind their head on coins to denote the idea of divine right. Romans used it for pagan gods like Apollo and also for the representations of emperors. Constantine had himself represented this way on a number of occasions. So these halos were a classical form, and now it's given Christian meaning, right? Where it was usually meant to denote someone who is godly, someone who is powerful in these earlier traditions. Now it shows Christ to be someone who is divine and who is powerful in this new Christian set of beliefs. So Roman forms given Christian meaning. The other thing that this image does a great job of showing is how we have both classical and non-classical elements coming together in terms of style in these early Christian mosaics. Remember, just as a side note, the mosaics were glittering. They captured a mystical atmosphere. They captured the light and the divinity of God. They were very popular in the early Christian architectural decoration. But also this shows that classical and non-classical coming together. So look at this image and see what you can spot. What kinds of things remind you of the classical precedents that we've seen? What is a return to something that's less classical? So let's mark them off. We have classical foreshortening, right? Look at the little sheepy next to Christ, kind of coming out toward us on a 3/4 view. We do have a little bit of modeling, although it's limited, so that's both classical and non-classical. Excuse me again. We have the imperial dress, which is classical. We have a more classical naturalistic type of pose. It's less frontal. We have a classical sense of space. There's even a sense of aerial perspective here, right, where things that are far away from us get kind of hazy and light and lose their color. So we've got a sense of space with those elements foreshortened out toward us and that limited sense of modeling. Christ is showing the classical calm. The proportions are okay. Not fantastic, not horrible. So he's not elongated or attenuated, but it's not quite as proportionate as classical precedents. So kind of in between on that one. But we also have some things that are distinctly non-classical. We've got stylization in the plant life, stylization in the wool of the sheep. We have a kind of generic sense to his face. Yes, he's showing the classical calm, but he's really not an individualized person. That is less classical. And as we said before, the anatomy is less proportionate and believable, less detailed. All of that is less classical. And again, we have kind of a linear sense to what's being portrayed here, right? The outlines are very linear on Christ's robe and on the outside of the sheep. All of that makes things seem a little more flat, and that too would be less classical. Here's a detail. You can see those individual tesserae, those pieces of the mosaic. This is the church of Saint Apollinaire Nuovo, also in Ravenna. Ravenna becomes an important city in the 5th and 6th century CE. After Rome itself as a city is less important, Ravenna becomes kind of the western capital of the Byzantine Empire for a time. And so we see a lot of works of architecture from this time period in Ravenna. This is a wonderful example of early Christian architecture and the importance the mosaics had in creating these mystical types of spaces. Here is a detail of one of the mosaics. Here is a detail looking down the nave. You can see how the mosaics line both sides of that nave. You've got virgin martyrs over here on this side, and we're going to look in detail at one specific segment. It's all the way up here in the upper right-hand corner. This here, the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. You can see this image so well, and it shows how mosaic was used. All of those individual pieces called tesserae and put together to create this image. This is a wonderful example of how in the early Christian era, as time goes on, we start to lose more and more of those classical elements and embrace more of those less classical elements. So things here, when we're looking at it, seems very flat. That's less classical. The figures are very frontal. That is less classical. We have a little bit of stylization in the robes, although that's not so terrible. And we have less believable bulk in the figures, and that's less classical. Their toes are pointed downward, and that makes them seem flattened out as well. The gold background is popular in early Christian times. It's meant to denote God's light and God's heavenly kind of presence. It's a symbol of heaven very often. All of that is denoted with the gold. However, that flat gold background also serves to kind of flatten out the sense of space overall. The figures are very still and very quiet, and that lack of believable sense of movement also makes them feel less classical. Their bodies aren't very proportionate. The modeling is pretty much non-existent at this point in time. These are all things that make this feel less classical in terms of style overall. And remember, excuse me, I'm sorry. Remember that the reason those early Christians liked the non-classical approach is that they felt like it would help them avoid being associated with paganism. They felt like it would help them avoid being confused with graven idolatry and images. And they also felt like they had a spiritual message they wanted to share through these works of art, and to use a non-classical, less physical style meant that their works would be more suited to portray those spiritual, less physical kinds of ideas. And remember, these are meant to be didactic. They're meant to teach the people all about the stories of Christianity and the important ideas of Christianity. All right, hang tight. We're almost here. This is our last example, the Old Farmer of Coriacus from the Vatican Virgil. Okay, this is not a religious text, as the name might suggest, since it's called the Vatican Virgil, but rather it is a collection of stories by Virgil, the classical writer. It's the oldest preserved of Greek and Latin manuscripts in this time period, and it originally had about 200 images illustrating Virgil's stories. We only have about 50 pages that survive today. And we don't want to take a ton of time on this, but I just want for you to see these examples and to see these details, because it lets you understand that the classical tradition just really doesn't completely die out throughout this whole early Christian period. Even though we see an increase in the non-classical approach, still we have things that are pretty classical popping up to us like this. We got a 3/4 view of that farmhouse in the background coming out toward us accurately in perspective and with foreshortening. And we've got modeling on the figures and on the building. We even have atmospheric perspective in the back. All of these things make space seem more convincing. But the figures are less accurate in terms of bulk. The figures are more simplified. They do have more naturalistic poses, which is a little more classical, a little more movement and a little more action there. But really, these two kinds of approaches of both the classical and the non-classical continue to coexist throughout this early classical period.